you are holy, you are holy.
We proclaimed him King of Kings, didn't we? We just sang about his faithfulness. I don't know if you remember last week, we found ourselves observing this incredible miracle of Jesus. He was there with this huge, huge crowd feeding 5,000, which was probably closer to 10,000 people when you included the women and the children. I mean, it must have been awesome, right? I mean, can you just hear the disciples as they're going around picking up pieces? You know, were they humming? What were they saying? What were they saying? You may not believe it, but there is no record of anything being said by the disciples after that miracle. Nothing. No. Now that was amazing. No. Can you believe it? No. What are we going to do with all this stuff? No humming of a few bars of a song that, like we've sung, How Great Thou Art, or some other thing. Nothing. Yet at the end of the story that we're going to hear proclaimed this morning, from the Gospel of Matthew again, we'll hear the disciples worshiping Jesus as the Son of God as they fall before him on their knees. Evidently, what happened out on that lake made a greater impression on those men than the feeding of the 5,000. Wow, right? Maybe it was the culminating effect, kind of just like one thing after another, one wave of, this miracle, and now this, it was just too much. Maybe it was the fact that to them the sea was the realm of evil. Those waves that would come and swallow up ships were not the result of some phantom storm, some random storm, or some innocent breeze. They were the work of evil. Anyway, I want us to read this wonderful story I want to read this wonderful story this morning for us. And as I do, I want us to ponder how Jesus enters into this realm, walking on the water. All of which leads the disciples to, fall on their knees in worship before God, declaring Jesus is the Son of God. I also want to remind you of this. As we come to this text, what is taking place here follows right on the heels of what we looked at last week. The crowd had been fed, the leftovers collected, at which point you hear Jesus do something that, you probably wouldn't think that he would do. He sends the crowd away, and then he makes, did you catch what I'm saying? He commands, he tells the disciples to get in the boat and to go to the other side. I mean, there's no option. No option at all. So hear this wonderful story. I'm reading from Matthew chapter 14, beginning at verse 22 and reading through verse 33. Hear the word of the Lord for us today. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink. And beginning to sink, cried out to Jesus, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Did you notice how Jesus, instead of asking the disciples to suggesting that this was a thing to do, that he actually tells them? He actually makes them get in the boat. He issues a command. There's no discussion. There are no options given. There's no A and B. It's just A. This is it. And this was not about what was coming, the command of Jesus. This was really about what had happened. And when I say that, I'm not talking about the feeding of the 5,000. I'm talking about the death of John. You'll remember last week the news that Jesus had received, that John had died. You'll recall that Jesus had ended up on a beach, thinking he was going to this secluded place, this place of retreat, only to discover this crowd that was before him. A vast crowd to greet him. You'll also recall that Jesus was then moved in his splachna, He was moved with compassion in his gut. That he had compassion and began to heal the sick. The plan to get alone, it was just laid aside. Because the mission of God was before him. At least that's what it would seem, right? However, in the opening of this story, we discover that the retreat wasn't canceled. It was merely delayed. Hence the command, get in the boat. Hence the sending away of the crowd. Hence the retreat is back on. He is going to get alone with the Father, and nothing is going to stop it. Now, I'm guessing that many of you know this saying. It's something that I have discovered is distinctly British. I'll start it and you'll be able to finish it. Keep calm and carry on, right? Now, you who are English, British, probably embrace that statement. It's how you roll. You don't quit, you don't stop, you just carry on, right? You might whine about the government, the council, the prices, the pastor, you can fill in the blank. But in the end, you just keep going. Unlike those of us from different parts of the globe who decide that we're going to sue or whatever. I don't know. It's a wonderful attribute to have. This stick-to-itiveness, this commitment to just keep going. And I admire it, at least on one level, but I'm also troubled by it. You see, the truth is, we were not created to just carry on and carry on and carry on, to go and to go and to go. We are human, right? We are fragile. We need to stop. We need to refuel. We need to breathe. Truth is, as much as we might like to carry on and carry on, at some point we must all stop, or something will break, something will give way, and we'll find ourselves sinking under the weight of all that we've been carrying, because we're not designed to just keep going and going and going. All of this, I think, explains why I'm so glad that Jesus sent his disciples away, that he didn't just carry on. The one who created the world, the one who set the stars in space, the one who healed the sick, who raised the dead, who fed the hungry, he too needs to stop. And if you think about it, Jesus is the exact representation of God. He is God in the flesh, right? And so in a sense it reveals to us something of God that we already know, having read Genesis chapter 1 and 2. That on the seventh day, what did God do? He stopped. He rested. You see, in the beginning of this story, before we even really get started, we're reminded that we all need rest. That Sabbath is not a suggestion, that it's a necessity. And ultimately, when you think about it, to rest is a posture of trust. Stopping is a recognition that it doesn't all depend on me. That he is the one who holds this whole world in his hands. And we forget that, don't we? We think, well, I've got to keep going, I've got to do it because it depends on me. I need to be honest with you this morning. This is something that I struggle with. Maybe you too. That even though we might want to embrace that mantra of keeping calm and carrying on, that we also need to embrace this posture of Christ. That we need Sabbath, that we need rest, that we need to depend on him, not on ourselves. And I think this will come out in the story. Of course, at some point this retreat ends, doesn't it? And Jesus comes to the disciples, and we learn that they've been struggling against the wind and the waves. And while the Sea of Galilee is only about 7 miles wide, it's not very big. And while they've been on the sea probably for almost 12 hours, they're still just in the middle of it, fighting to get where they want to go. Now, before we go on, there's something that we need to understand. First, I'd remind you that they are exactly where Jesus made them go, where he wants them. I mean, how often do we find ourselves in a hard place and we begin looking in the mirror, or we begin looking around and wondering, what did I do wrong? This is a reminder that the struggles that we face are not always the result of our folly. Sometimes it's just life. Secondly, and this is more vital in this story for us to realize, the storm was not the problem. You know, we have lots of these stories of Jesus on the Sea of Galilee. And there are times when Jesus is with the disciples on the Sea of Galilee and they are petrified because of the wind and the waves, and they think life is done, it's over, right? But that's not the case in this story. Oh, to be sure, they're not enjoying themselves that much. I mean, they're having to fight the wind and the waves. But there's no sense of fear in their eyes. They're more annoyed. That is until the aberration, right? The ghost. Those waves were really just part of their life. They understood the propensity of this lake to do what it did, for storms to rise up like they did. It was part of their livelihood as fishermen. And they knew that they just had to, keep calm and carry on. And I think that's a great picture of our lives. Our lives can often be difficult, right? It can sometimes feel like it's taking forever to get where we want to go. And there are probably times within the midst of those struggles where we wonder if we will ever get to where we want to be. And amazingly, in our story, Jesus comes to them right at this point. I mean, think about it. Jesus could have gone ahead to wherever they were going to meet him on the other side. He could have just showed up there. But instead, Jesus comes to them where they find themselves in the midst of their struggles in that boat. We're told he comes walking towards them on the water. Let me just stop right there. I think we need to remember something from these words. Nothing can keep Jesus away. There is no obstacle that you face, that you are in. There's no circumstances that you're in that prohibit or prevent Christ from entering in. As it says in Psalm 77, his way went straight through the sea. His pathway went right through the mighty waters. But his footprints left no trace. He finds a way to meet us where we are, not where we want to be, or where he hopes we might be. And all of this kind of leads us to this most intriguing part of the story with Peter and his impertinence. At least that's how we kind of view it, isn't it? I mean, why would Peter ask Jesus to invite him out of the boat? Why would Peter even want to do this? I mean, what's going on here? I mean, it's true they were petrified by this figure that was coming towards them in the storm, right? This ghost. At first they thought that's what it was. It wasn't the storm that brought fear to their hearts. It was this ghost-like figure that was coming towards them, walking on the water. Because remember, the sea was not a kind place. Storms, like I said, were not random acts. They were the work of evil forces. And so to see this figure coming towards them, who knows what they were thinking? But evidently, as he gets close enough that he hears and he sees their fear, and he speaks into it, doesn't he? Jesus says, out of his abiding love, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." It's like he's saying, guys, it's me. See, look, it's me. And it's at this point that Peter speaks up and he says, "Lord, if it is you, tell me to come out on the water." Again, I find myself wondering, why in the world would Peter say this? I mean, you have to admit it's kind of strange. I mean, if Peter is seeking to prove the identity of Christ, couldn't he have just said, well, if it's you, calm the waves. If it's you, stop the wind. I mean, why would Peter risk his life? Why would he risk, at the very least, getting wet? Remember, while this was not the storm to end all storms, it was still causing them some consternation. But Peter says, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come out to you on the water. And when you think about it, it's kind of bold. You get the sense, in some respects, that Peter knows who he's talking to. Why else would he ask that kind of a question? Why would he have that kind of request? At some level, it seems that he understands that this really is Jesus. I mean, think about it. If things don't go right, Peter is going to end up very, very wet. And all of that leads me to this question that I have been pondering as I've read this story. Where is the safest place in this story? Where is the safest place in the storm? I'd be inclined to say, well, on the boat. Certainly not out among those angry waves. Certainly not with that phantom. And yet the reality, that's not true, is it? The safest place to be is with Jesus. And maybe Peter understood this instinctively. Now, by me suggesting that it's the safest place is to be with Jesus, I don't mean that this place is without risk or trouble. We might still get wet. We might still feel we're sinking. I'm not talking about a place where there's no storms. I'm talking rather about a place where we know the providential care of Jesus. We know his presence. I mean, ask Jonah. There in the belly of that whale, in the bottom of the sea, he discovered that God was right there. Because you see, his presence makes all the difference. That was the lesson of another storm that had come up on that same lake, where Jesus had been back in the back of the boat asleep. Remember that story? And the storm came up. It's in Matthew 8 if you want to read it. And you'll hear him say the same thing that he will say to Peter. Oh, you of little faith. Why did he say that? Because they failed to recognize that God was with them in the storm. They lost sight of his presence. I mean, let's talk about that phrase for a minute or two. Oh, you of little faith. You'll remember that when Jesus and Peter step back into the boat, Jesus says, and his words are directed in this passage only to Peter. He doesn't look at them all and say, oh, you of little faith. He looks at Peter and says, oh, you of little faith. Why did you doubt? I mean, I don't know about you. That seems a little unfair, don't you think? I mean, the guy, he stepped out of the boat. He walked on water. The rest of them, they just sat there like lumps on a log. He risked it, everything. And maybe you're sitting there thinking, well, maybe it would have been better if he just stayed in the boat. He wouldn't have been rebuked. He wouldn't have heard Jesus yell, I'm so disappointed in you, Peter. You failed again. And we hear that, don't we, in those words? Disappointment, rebuke. And there are many commentators who would agree with you. Yeah, I find myself wondering, what if instead of rebuke, what we are hearing from the lips of Jesus is a call for Peter to trust? That word doubt is an interesting word. Doubt is fundamentally divided attention. If you recall, out there among the waves, Peter finds his attention divided, doesn't he? Those waves looked a lot bigger out there on the water than they had back in the boat. And Jesus didn't quite look as big or as awesome out there amongst the waves as he had been in the boat. Jesus is fading. The waves are growing. You see, faith is not a commodity of which Peter needs more. Faith is about a consistent trust in Jesus. When Jesus speaks to Peter, he's not suggesting that he be more like the other disciples. He's calling Peter to step out further. He's calling him to give him his undivided trust, not just his divided trust. Something else, I think it's very easy as we read this story to get kind of caught up in Peter's failure. Well, he failed here and he failed, before the Sanhedrin. This guy is just a litany of failures all over the place. But there's something wonderful in this story that we can't afford to miss. There he is. He's walking on the water. I mean, that's amazing, right? I mean, let's just say that. That's pretty cool. I mean, at some point, he notices the wind and the waves. And as we've already noted, his attention at that point is divided. Jesus, the wind. Jesus, the wind. Jesus, the wind, the wind, the wind. And yet this is what I want you to notice. On sinking, what does Peter the fisherman do? He doesn't do the breaststroke, does he? He doesn't call to the boat. He doesn't call out to his brother Andrew. He calls for Jesus. Peter recognized, didn't he, where his help came from. He recognized that the safety that he longed for was not in the boat, but it was standing right there in front of him amongst the waves. I mean, that's faith. He knew that his security was not found in that boat or anyone on that boat, but it was in Jesus. He knew the safest place that he could be was in the waves with Jesus. Of course, in quick succession, Jesus reaches out his hand and lifts Peter up, and they come to the boat. And as they step into that boat, the wind and the waves die. No command is given, they just die. And those who are in the boat, Peter included, they just fall to their knees because they recognize that the man who's standing before them is none other than the Son of God. It's a great story, isn't it? We're going to sing in a moment, and Paige is going to come and lead us. I wonder, can we envision that we are together on that boat? Now, don't get seasick, all right? So I don't want anybody, no reaching for little bags or anything, all right? Can you feel the waves? Can you feel it, the boat moving? Do you realize that in the early church, a boat was seen as a metaphor for the church? So here we are, in our boat, together, the church. Maybe like the disciples, we don't feel like we're getting where we want to go either. Maybe we feel like life is not what we'd hoped it would be. Maybe it feels like the wind is against us. We're trying to do the right thing. We think we're doing what God has called us to do, and it just feels like it's not what we expected. The waves, the circumstances that we find surrounding us are tossing us this way and that. Do you know what I'm speaking about? Life can be that way, can't it? Like I said before, just because you follow Jesus doesn't mean it's going to be easy. I mean, it certainly wasn't for those disciples. And not just here on that lake, but many, many other times. And if you read the history of the early church, you'll discover that most of them were martyred for their faith. Remember, he made them go on this lake. Anyway, we're here on this boat together. Do you see James and John? They're up at the front. They're looking to where they need to go. Andrew, he's over here by the rudder. Thomas, Matthew, you probably don't want to look towards them. They look a little green. They're sitting over here on the side. These waves are getting to them a little bit. They're not used to this sea thing. Now, do you see him? Do you see Jesus? He's walking towards us. He's coming to us in our boat, walking in the midst of the storm, in the midst of our struggles, in the midst of our difficulties. And he's come here this morning. I mean, who would have thought that he would choose to come here? And yet he is. Did you hear that? He just said something. Take heart. Be encouraged. It's me. You don't have to be afraid. Now, as he says that, he's not denying the reality of what we face. I mean, the challenges are daunting, but he is reminding us of his presence and the difference that he can make. So here we are in the boat. The waves. And maybe some of us are being called to recognize that our security is not in the boat. It's in him. Perhaps Jesus is saying to us as the church that your security is not in anything but me. Will you come to me? Are you willing? Are you willing to step out of your comfort zone? Are you willing to step out into the waves? Are you willing to come to him, to leave behind what you know, your security? Are you willing to trust only in him? Maybe you're sitting there and you can see the waves. You occasionally get splashed a little bit by the water, and you're sitting there thinking, I've tried. I've tried again and again, and each time I've failed. Each time the only result has been me getting wet. And then you look back and you think, I stepped out of the boat, and the only thing I did was breaststroke. As you return to the boat. Maybe this morning, instead of turning back to the boat, instead of turning back to this where you think your security is found,
Maybe you need to turn to Jesus and join Peter in saying, Lord, save me. Recognizing that the true lifesaver is not found on a boat.
it's found in him. I really believe that this morning that Christ has come by this place. And I know that as we respond to him, that like the disciples in the end, you know what's going to happen? We're going to fall on our knees in worship, because we will recognize that he is the Son of God. You see, Jesus has entered this place, coming to us on the storm, in the midst of our struggles, in the midst of your struggles, and he has come to be with us, because he's a with us God. And even as we might find ourselves distracted by the storms, the trials, the struggles, all we have to do is cry out to him, and he will lift us up, because truly he is the Son of God.
as you sit there, will you join me in singing and just allow the Spirit of God to speak to you? And will you be obedient to whatever He might call you to do?